Myself and a good friend were taking a camping trip, as we did every year. It was a tradition for us to get together and get away from it all for a long weekend, doing something we enjoyed. We always looked to try different locations for our getaway, and this time, I was in charge of finding the place and planning the trip. I ended up choosing somewhere in Oregon, across country, but we had a bit of a drive to reach it. But that was part of the fun, the journey. When we arrived, we were both impressed and agreed I had chosen well. The scenery was amazing, and it was not short of trails we could take to explore. Wasting no more time, we delved into the chambers of wilderness, following one of the main trails where we could look to find the perfect spot to set up our camp. Through our hike, we passed a few others who were on the trails, exploring just like we were. But the further we traveled, we became more isolated with no one around, which is what we wanted and what we were looking for. After hours of exploring, we finally came across a plot of land we settled upon and set up our campsite. After setting up our tent, we then set up our campfire, getting out some food and drinks and sitting back and taking in all the peace and calmness that surrounded us in the middle of nowhere. After we'd ate and with the sun setting, we continued with more drinks into the night as we talked about endless topics of conversation and reminisced on previous trips we'd been on together. Before we knew it, looking at the time, it had gone midnight, and with us both feeling beat from our first day, we put out our fire and headed to our tents to get our heads down for the night. After passing out for what felt like hours, I was awoken to the sound of what I'd describe as a light thud hitting my tent. As I rubbed my eyes listening out, the sound was again quickly followed by another, as the thud of a small object once again vibrated off my tent. Looking at the time, I saw I'd only been in the tent just under an hour. As I sat up, again another thud hit my tent. It was like objects were being thrown at it. I called out to Jeff, my friend, thinking it may have been him, but I got no reply. Calling again, he finally answered. I asked him if he had thrown something at my tent. He quickly replied asking me what I was on about and that he hadn't thrown anything at my tent. Unzipping my tent, I looked outside to see that his tent was indeed still zipped up. Scanning the area, I couldn't see anything, and the silence filtering through our campsite was eerily quiet. Jeff opened his tent as he looked over to me, telling me it was probably just the pines falling from the trees above, and that it had happened to his tent not too long ago. Thinking about it and looking around at where we were, in the middle of nowhere, I agreed with him, feeling that may genuinely have been the case. Lying back down in my tent, I closed my eyes, trying to get myself back to sleep. It wasn't long after I'd laid back down though. I again woke to another sound outside my tent. As I sat up, this time, I could hear the sound of footsteps outside my tent as they approached, stopping abruptly outside my tent. Assuming once more this time it may have been Jeff heading to the toilet, I called out his name to see if he was okay. As I did, the footsteps started up again, this time retreating into the distance without a reply. Calling his name once more, he finally replied, but his voice sounding from the opposite direction to which the footsteps had gone. Asking if he was up and okay, he again replied he was in bed trying to sleep. At this point, I began to feel uneasy and freaked out. If Jeff was still in his tent, then whose footsteps had I just heard walking around my tent? Not wanting to believe it was anyone other than Jeff out there, I slowly opened up my tent again, looking out into the darkness of our camp, and over to Jeff's tent where it again lay, closed. Looking around our camp, it was as we'd left it. Desolate, just our burnt-out campfire and chairs. I hesitantly called out to Jeff again as I exited my tent, heading over to his, knowing full well what I had heard. Opening up his tent, I could see the annoyance on his face as he asked me what was up. I told him that I had heard footsteps walking around the tent, that maybe there was someone else out there. Looking around, he scanned the area before looking back at me, with that look you get when someone doesn't quite believe you. He got out his tent as he asked if I'd seen any footprints to prove that, but I hadn't. He said that maybe an animal had crossed through our camp, intrigued from what they could smell, before fleeing when hearing our voices, as there was definitely no one else around. I didn't share the same theory as him, as I was pretty certain to what I'd heard. I told him I was going to take a quick look around and sit up for a bit to put my mind at ease. Jeff, tired, nodded as he headed back to bed, telling me there was nothing to worry about and that I should get some sleep. He was probably right, but I wasn't going to sleep until I was sure. So, scanning the immediate tree lining surrounding us, and not seeing anything outside of the ordinary, I was satisfied enough to head back to my tent, laying back down with my mind slowly calmed as I finally managed to drift off. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up with my heart racing in a sheer panic to the terrifying sound of a scream reverberating through the camp. As I zipped open my tent, I was horrified to see the scream had come from Jeff. Not only that, but my eyes fell upon the sight of his tent wide open as he lay outside of it, as pale as a ghost clutching his leg. Quickly running over to him, I shouted, "What happened?" As I got closer, I could see the blood coming from his leg, and the fear in his eyes as he pointed over to the tree lining. What he said next scared the shit out of me. He told me that there was someone else out there, and that he had woken up to movement and rustling in his tent. As he had sat up to look and turn his phone light on, he was met with the sight of a gaunt, lanky man sitting over him in his tent, watching him as he slept. When Jeff had processed what was happening, and that it wasn't a dream, he screamed. But as he did, the man had stabbed him through the leg with what seemed to be a blade. Jeff, not a small guy by any means, had fought him off when the man had then fled back into the forest out of sight. I looked to where Jeff was pointing, my heart racing as I could see the outline of a tall figure retreating into the forest as it travelled further away. With Jeff injured and not wanting to risk whoever that was coming back, we quickly covered up Jeff's wounds and gathered our essential belongings, leaving behind our tents as we headed the way we had came. There was no way we were staying around. Having to support Jeff and help him down, it took us an age to get back to the car. All the while I was looking back, feeling like we were being stalked. My eyes feeling like I could see the person stalking us at every turn. When we finally arrived back at the car, I drove us to the nearest hospital to get Jeff patched up. I reported what I could to the police, but in all honesty it was useless. We never really got a good clear look at the person, and it would be impossible to find them in that open forest. It's safe to say we were lucky Jeff woke up when he did, because who knows what that person's true intentions were. It's scary to think what a person like that doing out there alone in the wilderness. That haunting experience hasn't killed our love for camping completely, but it took us a while to find the confidence to get back out there. And now, we always camp armed, as you never know what can happen, or who you could come across in the middle of nowhere. My job requires me to travel across country a lot, and for the most part I enjoy what I do. The opportunity to travel to new places makes every trip different. To be alone with my own thoughts and to have that independence, it's great. That being said, one trip I had recently taken, it's left me terrified and questioning the world we live in. I'd stopped off and filled up the tank at a rest stop halfway through my journey, grabbing myself a bite to eat whilst I could. I wanted to make sure there was plenty of gas in the tank, as on these routes, stations were few and far between, and having nearly run out of petrol on a previous trip, I'd learned my lesson. So, having filled up and getting back on my way, I continued the route to my destination. This was a night drive, so as the sun faded into the distance and the night grew stronger, the road was near empty, which I find nice. There's something therapeutic about driving at night with no other vehicles on the road. Apart from the odd car passing here and there, it makes for a peaceful journey. As I was a good hour into my drive since leaving the rest stop, I was heading down a long stretch of road nestled neatly in between the surrounding forest, where the towering trees overside nearly consumed the night sky, the faint glimmer of stars and moonlight breaking through occasionally. As I was driving down, taking a sip from my coffee, it was then my car began to jolt, the engine sounding like it was chugging, my foot still on the accelerator but the car slowing, until I came to a complete stop. Not knowing what the hell had just happened or what was wrong with the car. I had just filled up the tank, so I knew it wasn't gas. Pretty much still had a full tank. As the car rolled to a whimpering stop, I had managed to direct it to the side of the road. I sat there looking out into the open, isolated road in front of me. Now, not knowing too much about the mechanics of a car, I was struggling to think what the issue could have been. Turning the key, hoping and willing for it to start back up, I was met by the sound of chugging, as the engine sounded as if it was trying to turn over, but ultimately failing. Shit, I thought to myself, as I stepped out of the car, grabbing my phone. Popping the hood of the car, I turned my light on my phone to take a look to see if I could see anything as to what it could be. But everything looked fine. The engine oil was at a perfect level. That's as far as my diagnostics went. Looking around, it was dark and eerily silent. No sign of any other cars on the road, and having not passed a single vehicle in what seemed like the past half hour, it was unlikely anyone would be coming by anytime soon. The only option I had was to call for a tow. Looking at my phone, that's when my heart sank. I had no signal whatsoever. Now I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no means of contacting anyone. Sitting back in my car, knowing I was fucked, I tried the car one more time, but still it wouldn't work. Having limited options, I debated on what to do. If I walked, I would be walking for hours to get back to some sort of civilization. If I sat waiting for someone to pass by again, I could be waiting for hours. Looking at the time, that's when I noticed it. My watch. My watch had stopped working too. Looking at the time on my phone again. That had not changed since the last time I had looked at it. What the hell? My car cutting out, my watch stopping, and the time not changing on my phone, plus no service. I thought to myself all of that combined was strange. What was going on? Was I in some dead zone along this stretch of road? Deciding to sit tight and wait for another driver to pass, I shut my car door, thinking over the possibility of being stranded here for hours. As I sat thinking, it was then a glimmer of light caught my eye. Looking out the window, up ahead in the distance, a ball of white light appeared. The feeling of relief hit me, as the sight of headlights in the distance was my chance of help. Stepping out my car, I stood in front, staring ahead at the light. As I stood there, I noticed it never moved. It never got closer. It just stayed, static in the same position. Then, as I really studied it, through squinting eyes, I noticed it. The light was floating in mid-air. The sound of the trees swaying in the wind stopped, as everything fell silent. It was as if I had gone deaf. All sound ceased to exist. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my heart beating in my chest. I can't describe the feeling that I had, but as I looked back at the light, it floated higher in the air as it grew brighter. Coming to terms with it not being another vehicle, I had no idea what the fuck it was. But as it floated in midair in the distance, it began to move closer towards me. I could feel my temperature rising as my pulse raced. The light grew closer as it got brighter, near blinding me. I scrambled back to my car door, my senses all out of sync as I still couldn't hear a thing. Throwing myself inside my car and locking the door, I grabbed my phone, my first thought to video whatever this was. But as I did, my screen was glitching like crazy. My phone hot like it was overheating. Looking back out at the light as it closed in on me, I felt like my heart was going to beat out of my chest. The light grew, consuming the area as it hovered higher in the sky, directly in front of my car. As it slowly traveled directly above the car, I closed my eyes, panicking, not knowing what to do. When all of a sudden, darkness fell. Opening my eyes, the glowing light had gone. The deathly silence still present. Not even hearing my own rapid breaths. Sitting in my seat, trying to compose myself, it was then everything came at once. The beaming, blinding light burst down upon the car as all sound returned, blaring out loud. The sound of the wind and trees swaying, amplified by a strange buzzing sound as the car began to shake. My screams reverberated through the night as I closed my eyes, gripping my car seat. The car shaking rapidly as if it was about to explode. I thought that was it. I thought this was my end. I went lightheaded and everything faded to black. When, all of a sudden, the shaking stopped. The loud blaring sounds calmed. The light disappeared. Slowly opening one eye, I sat up, releasing myself from my cocooned curled-up position. Hearing the sounds of my own shaky breaths as I looked out the window. The strange light was gone. Nowhere to be seen. Just the stars floating in the sky and the moonlight breaking through the swaying trees. Trying to compose myself, I grabbed my phone. No longer hot, no longer glitching. The service returned. Opening my car door, I slowly stepped out. There was nothing but open road. Looking at my watch, the time was a few minutes ahead of the last time I looked at it. Now working. It felt like I had been there for ages. I couldn't explain it or wrap my head around what had just happened. Sitting back in my car, I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life. The car started perfectly fine. I was dumbfounded and terrified at the same time by what I had just experienced. Something I couldn't explain. Something otherworldly. Everything felt overwhelming. I questioned myself getting back in my car and getting the hell out of there. The rest of that night, my mind raced, struggling to understand what I had just experienced. Eventually telling my friends and family what had happened. Some were shocked with what I told them. Some laughed, not taking what I said seriously. Since that night, I've looked at the world differently. I've done research on that area and listened to stories similar to mine that people have experienced in different locations. I fully believe I encountered a UFO, an otherworldly presence or whatever you want to call it that night. But the memory of that night will always stay with me. The fear I felt, I don't think I'll ever get answers to it. But what I do know is, we are not as alone as we think. Hey guys, thanks for joining us in this one. We hope you enjoyed this video. And as you can see, even in the middle of nowhere, you can find yourself in a terrifying situation. Have any of you found yourself in a chilling encounter when exploring? Let us know in the comments. Just a quick one guys, we see a lot of you joining us are not subscribed. If you're enjoying the content, come join us over in our dark corner of the world and hit that subscribe button. We really appreciate it and enjoy growing the Horror Motives community. Thanks again, and until the next video, remember, fear lies within.